Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, I have a funny feeling that coming up to Christmas, there might be a few of you who've asked jolly old Saint Nick for a 3D printer. And FDM printers, so ones that use heated plastic in a deposition molding method, to use some fancy terms there, like the Ender 3, are a pretty good starting point. You know, they are, as I looked at it when I first got mine, baby's first 3D printer. What that means for you wargaming types out there is you can start churning out tanks for cents at a time. But they do benefit from a little bit of prep work before you get to painting them. So I'm going to show you how I prepare my FDM prints for painting. So if you decide to pick up, or you're lucky enough to end up with a 3D printer, how can you prep them for the table so they look pretty good? Well, let's get started. Now, it's worth quickly noting the differences between FDM, which is what a printer like an Ender 3 will give you, versus resin printing. So let's get an up-close look at one of these vehicles. If I show you here the truck that I've got, you'll see there is a little bit of stepping, particularly when you get to these flatter areas. Now, this is printed at I think this is 1.12 millimeter height, so there's a bit of texture to it. We can prepare this in such a way that that will be less visible, and I think for vehicles like trucks and stuff, it's not going to matter. I can either spend $25 or whatever on a truck kit from Rubicon, or I can spend 20 cents in PLA and have something that'll just look fine on the table. But by comparison, a resin vehicle, this you will not see or hear. Once this is painted, it will be almost indistinguishable from a plastic kit. This is actually a 1/100 scale model which has been scaled up in my slicer. So that's one of the advantages of 3D printing. You don't always need a file which is exactly the right scale for your machine, for the game you're playing. You can just play around with the size. Painting resin stuff, you're not going to need to do a lot of prep work. But when it comes to your FDM prints, like I said, those layer lines you're going to want to try and mitigate. So here's what I've prepared earlier, and this is what we're going to paint today. You'll see I've got this green gunk on the side, and this is liquid green stuff from Citadel. There are all sorts of filling putties that you can use for this. What we're trying to do is reduce the visible stepping. This is just one way of going about that. So along the edge of this canvas here, you'll hear there's quite a rough texture to it. So what I'm going to do, you'll probably see some of the clues there. I'm going to take this liquid green stuff. You can apply this with a brush, but it's not as much fun. And I find this is easier to work it into the layer lines. So take your time and just fill over. And as you're doing it, kind of smooth out with your finger. And you'll see, oh, there we go. It's messy, but we are going to help fill in those layer lines. They'll still be visible ultimately. We can't get rid of them entirely, but this will help mitigate some of the appearance of them. Once this is dried, you want to leave this for a couple of hours. Even better if you can leave it overnight, to be honest. But once it's dried, you just take some fine grit sandpaper to it and smooth it out. So that's just one way that you can mitigate these layer lines. And that's what I've done on that Valentine. So I'm going to go back to that for now. So back to our Valentine, and you can see I've used the liquid green stuff on a couple of these areas just to smooth them out. And once that's filed, or sanded down, you'll get a pretty decent finish. But we can do some more, and what I'm going to do is actually gloss varnish this whole thing. So I've got here, this is my Vallejo gloss varnish. Any gloss varnish you can do, you can spray it on or you can brush it on. I like spraying it because I think it gives a slightly smoother finish overall. But what I'm going to do is just gloss varnish this whole miniature before we even prime it. Now, sometimes when you're priming things, you're trying to avoid filling in areas of detail. So if you're priming a miniature, you don't want to spray too much white or black because it'll obscure detail. On our 3D prints, these FDM ones, the detail that we're trying to obscure is layer lines, so you can be pretty brutal with this. So what I'm going to do now is I will put this somewhere that I can prime it, and gloss varnish it, and then we'll give that about half an hour for the varnish to set properly. Now, of course, by its nature, varnish is transparent, so it can be a little difficult to see what you've got. It's not such a bad thing though, and once we prime this, it's going to be a little bit clearer. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and hit it with a primer. I'm going to use Vallejo's, what is it called, Russian uniform. Reason being that these Valentines would have been sent to Russia via the Lend-Lease program from England, and they wouldn't have repainted them. So I'm going to use, British colours to paint this Soviet vehicle. Now once that's dried, you'll see we've gotten rid of most of the layer lines. There's still a little bit of it visible, but that's not a huge issue. I have also got here the hull, so you can see especially those stepped areas on the storage boxes there, they came out pretty well. They're fairly smooth, and once we finish painting, that'll pretty much disappear. So from here, we can paint it much the same way as we would, our vehicles ordinarily. So I've got my Agrex Earthshade on the way. So, time to apply this generously to the whole model. Grab yourself a big old brush, and let's start getting this into all of these recesses. Then, same as always, give it about 20 to 30 minutes to dry, and we'll get a look at what we have then. Now, when at last that's dried, you might notice that it does accentuate some of the layer lines again, which, using a shade, it will happen quite naturally. What I'm going to do though, I've got here, this is a bit of sponge. And we're just going to go ahead and dab the base color back over most of the areas of the vehicle. We're going to do this instead of, overbrushing, because this gives us a little bit more control, and it gives us, I think it looks kind of cool. You'll see this a little better once it dries. Let's go ahead and do this over the whole vehicle and see how that affects the look. Just quickly as I'm applying it here to the turret, you may want to be a little more generous with it than you might think. Like if I flip it up, we get a look at how that changes the top. This is very definitely a style choice, but I think it looks kind of cool, and it's going to help. Essentially, we're tricking the eye here. Now once you've gone around the tank a couple of times, you'll end up with something that looks like this. And it's not perfect. We're not going for perfect. We're going for a deliberate style here. And I think this does quite effectively hide, the layer lines, the sort of the worst culprit of this 3D print. And when we put it down at table distance, let's just focus on that. That looks kind of cool. That will look good on the table. So what I'm going to do now is actually mix up. I want a little bit of Russian uniform, and I'm going to mix that 50-50 with some dark sand. I'm going to skip over most of the painting steps from now because they're honestly identical to what I'd normally do. So let's get ahead, and I'm just going to finish the tank off here. Now there we have it. After all of its weathering has been applied, we have a finished vehicle. And honestly, I don't think that looks too bad at all. You will notice a difference between any FDM prints and any resin prints or plastic kits. So I recommend if you are looking at 3D printing your own vehicles for an army, stick to one style for the whole force, so that they'll look more uniform with one another. Now this came off an Ender 3, and it was an absolutely stock machine. So we're talking, this is entry-level 3D printer stuff, and I think you can get a pretty good result. Now there are a couple of really good designers on Thingiverse, so if you want free 3D printer files, STL files, to have a go with, you can go just search for stuff on Thingiverse. It's all free. A lot of fun to play around with. But there is one dude in particular who he organizes his designs in such a way that there are detail plates which print flat on the print bed, so you avoid some of the stepping sort of effect that's visible here, and then kind of like a plastic kit, you glue those plates onto the outside of a hull section. So there's actually very little that you have to do for prep work. So I'll make sure I link his stuff too, because they're brilliant. Anyhow, hopefully something was interesting to you here. Slightly quicker video this time, but, something which I think has a fairly broad application. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. And as always, thank you very much to all of my lovely patrons who've helped make this possible, including producers Ben Hicks, Kyrie Crawford, Alan Nuttall, Trainboy, and Connor. So, thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.